Hello, good evening everyone, welcome to Nottingham Contemporary and tonight's lecture. I'm really delighted to welcome Professor David Scott here this evening, who is a professor of anthropology at Columbia University in New York, and an eminent post-colonial theorist, if I may. Two of his books that I particularly want to draw your attention to, and should you feel inclined, we also have upstairs in our study, are Refashioning Futures from 1999, which was looking at criticism after post-coloniality. And a particular relevance for tonight's lecture and the context of the exhibition upstairs is from 2004, Conscripts of Modernity, The Tragedy of Colonial Enlightenment, which is a reconsideration of C.L.R. James's The Black Jacobins, published in 1938, and a highly influential anti-colonial telling of the story of the Haitian Revolution. Also extremely significant is David's work as a founding editor of the journal Small Acts, which, if you don't know it, comes very highly recommended from me at least, and from many, as a platform through which many of the debates about the history of Haitian art and culture have been raised and debated, often quite controversially, and again it's a source that I'd really recommend. And I'm also equally delighted to welcome Christian Hogsberg, which I'm pronouncing as well as I can in an English way, who is a historian who teaches at Leeds Metropolitan University and has edited a forthcoming publication of C.L.R. James's play of, about the Haitian Revolution, Toussaint Louverture, the story of the only successful slave revolt in history. And Christian has kindly agreed to help facilitate the discussion after David's lecture. He'll open up the discussion with some questions from David and then we will provide an opportunity, of course, for you to ask questions, and there will be a microphone roving around the room for you to use. So I'm going to pass on to David, and thank you all for coming, and thanks very much for being here.
Thank you very, very much, Isabel, and thank you very much. I can't see a thing, and thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me, and thanks to Alex as well for having me at his institution, and very many thanks to Christian for fitting this into his schedule. Christian and I have been in something of a conversation given his own interests in C.L.R. James's telling of the story of the Haitian Revolution. So I'm simply going to, if you'll forgive me, read, and then we will see how it goes. The Theory of Haiti. What is the contemporary theory problem about Haiti? To phrase it somewhat differently, what is the conceptual conundrum or the ideological problem space in relation to which Haiti is made to appear today as the visible sign of a predicament, a resolution, a truth? What theory of Haiti enables it to perform this labor? What motivations call it into play? What demand gives it force and form? What, in short, is the question to which Haiti is offered as an exemplary answer? In posing these general questions, I mean, of course, to underline, in a now somewhat old-fashioned way, perhaps, the non-self-evidence, the non-transparency of Haiti as a figure in the varied discourses, popular and scholarly, in which it is constructed and through which it circulates. From the fabulous tales of 18th century colonial prosperity to the images of screaming despair after the catastrophic earthquake of 12 January 2010, Haiti has forever been, in no small part, a fable, less an historicizable geopolitical place than a haunting space of vivid, often racialized and sexualized imagination. Whether under the sign of perverted luxury or disemboweling violence or impenetrable mystery, Haiti has never ceased to be an overdetermined, over-cathected fascination. Where Haiti is concerned, there seems almost always the pervasive sense of an unnerving gap between itself and its otherness. Many years ago, the now late Michel Rolph Trouillot drew our attention to some of the ways in which this apprehension of otherness has functioned to produce the idea of Haiti as exception. As he put it, quote, "A notion of Haitian exceptionalism permeates both the academic and popular literature on Haiti under different guises and with different degrees of candidness," unquote. Haiti, so it appears to many, is a unique, quote unquote, to foreigners as well as to the Haitian elite. However, it is not unique in the obvious ways in which all historical societies may be said to be distinct cultural historical formations, but rather in ways that suspiciously render it unintelligible, or at least in need of a sui generis sort of explanation. And lurking behind this idea of Haiti's special status, Trouillot perceived the shadow of a hidden agenda, namely the motivation to obscure the relations of power and knowledge through which Haiti has been historically inscribed in an asymmetrical global structure. Haitian exceptionalism, he writes, and I quote, has been a shield that masks the negative contribution of the Western powers to the Haitian situation. Haitian exceptionalism functions to obscure Haiti's integration into a world dominated by Christianity, capitalism, and whiteness. The more Haiti appears weird, the easier it is to forget that it represents the longest neocolonial experiment in the history of the West, unquote. I think this is right. In pointing to this exceptionalism, though, Trouillot's critical point in the end was to make a plea for a less isolationist and more comparativist framework within which to set Haiti's cultural history. Again, I think this is salutary. Indeed, this style of thinking was in many ways one of the hallmarks of Trouillot's inspiring contribution to Caribbean studies. But I would also want to draw an additional and somewhat different lesson from this from Trouillot's insight, one not so much connected to better informed or more diverse empirical scholarship, as concerned with cultivating a more acutely reflexive self-consciousness about the conceptual and ideological labors or discursive objects are made to perform. I mean by this that such scholarly objects as Haiti are always inscribed in conceptual and ideological problem spaces. They are theory problems. They activate answers, in other words, to a more or less implicit structure of questions. And consequently, in order to make visible the uses to which these discursive objects are being put, in a certain sense, the ideological motivations they perform, it is necessary to reconstruct the questions that organize and give point to the problem spaces in which these objects are generated. Consider Trouillot's discipline, anthropology, American cultural anthropology specifically, in which, at least since Melville J. Herskowitz's seminal work, a certain idea of Haiti has been called upon to help organize a distinctive way of thinking about the cultures of peoples of African descent in the New World. Recall that when, in the summer of 1934, Herskowitz arrived in Haiti, he was already equipped with a well-articulated theory problem into which to insert it, namely the problem of how to demonstrate the cultural continuities between Africa and the African Americas. This was a theory problem with political ideological sources in the consequential debates about the African Americas coming out of the Harlem Renaissance years. Herskowitz was no negligible observer of the new cultural politics of black modernism in the 1920s and 1930s, and also with political ideological implications for the future study of the African Americas. Memorably, Herscovitz's theory of acculturation, and in particular his scale of Africanisms, was to provide the means of measuring the authentic presence of African retentions in the former slave societies of the New World, and so to demonstrate conclusively that Africans in the Americas had an identifiable or bona fide cultural heritage. Herskovitz had already found the living traces of a deep Africa among the Maroons of Suriname, the subject of Rebel Destiny, published in 1934, and he had subsequently done field research in Dahomey, now Benin, along the old slave coast, in order to have an experience of the real Africa, the subject of Dahomey, an ancient West African kingdom, published in 1938. Now, returning to the Americas to close, so to speak, the hermeneutic circle, Herskovitz was convinced that he would find a direct cultural connection between Dahomey and Haiti. Famously, the monograph he published in 1937, Life in a Haitian Valley, was not merely a keenly observed ethnography, but a many-sided intervention. It was, for example, a sober professional rebuttal of the sensationalized and lurid images of primitivism and exotic barbarism through which Haiti was constructed for US consumption in the 1920s and 1930s in such travel books as William Seabrook's The Magic Island and Richard Loderer's Voodoo Fire in Haiti. But perhaps most importantly, from the point of view I'm developing here, Life in a Haitian Valley established Haiti as a fundamental anthropological theory object, a paradigmatic instance of the theory of New World culture change and adaptation, such that Haiti now appeared to be, after Suriname, the most African culture in the Americas. And yet, as we know, this particular imagining of Haiti, namely Haiti as answering an acculturation theory problem, was not the only Haiti potentially available in the 1930s to the observant and engaged Herskovitz. For recall that Herskovitz had arrived in Haiti in the summer of 1934, literally just as the much detested US Marines were ending their brutal 19-year occupation. And taking up the advice of the Haitian scholar Jean Prismars, he had spent 12 weeks of his typically brief research trip in the town of Mirebalais, a center of the 1918-1920 Caco insurgency against the occupation led by Charlemagne Perrault. Curiously, though, as controversial as the US presence was, as violently disruptive as it was of Haitian cultural, political, and economic life, it seemed irrelevant, even invisible, to Herskovitz as an interpretive condition, as a source of Haiti, as a theory problem. In short, Herskovitz's Haiti encounter took place in a polyvalent field of varied discursive possibilities, and had his questions, his perceived provocations, been different ones, he might well have constructed Haiti as a political problem about sovereignty, rather than a cultural problem about Africa in the Americas. I do not want to belabor unduly this perhaps not familiar enough story about anthropology's Haiti, intriguing though its many directions might be. However, I have a general point that this cursory reflection on the making of Haiti as a distinctively anthropological object well demonstrates. I mean to remind ourselves of something we all, in fact, already know, given the linguistic turn and the pervasiveness of the doctrine of social constructionism it spawned, but too readily forget, given perhaps the assimilation and normalization of this doctrine of social constructionism. And that is simply that our objects, even philosophical ones, have conceptual histories and therefore ideological densities, and consequently, however seemingly straightforward such objects might appear, however seemingly given on the surface of our discourses, they bear a certain reflexive scrutiny regarding the services they perform in the theory uses to which they are variously put. Imagining Haiti, in other words, is never not a dimension of a theory problem. In offering these cautionary remarks concerning the construction of Haiti as a theory problem, I mean to afford myself some skeptical room in which to come at the recent provocative characterization of the Haitian Revolution in terms of some idea of universality or universal history or the politics of universal human rights. It is a characterization that appears to signal, at times in somewhat spectacular language, the arrival of Haiti as a specifically philosophical problem. Take, for example, Laurent Dubois, certainly one of the most distinguished contemporary historians of Haiti and its revolution. The transformation of slaves into citizens, he writes, represented, and I quote, the most radical political transformation of the age of revolution that stretched from the 1770s to the 1830s and constituted the most concrete expression of the idea that the rights proclaimed in France's 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen were indeed universal. If we live in a world in which democracy is meant to exclude no one, it is in no small part because of the actions of those slaves in Saint-Domingue who insisted that human rights were theirs too, unquote. Similarly, the historian Franklin Knight maintains that Haiti played an inaugural and, quote, inordinately important role in the articulation of a version of human rights as it forged the second independent state in modern history, unquote. And perhaps most passionately, Nick Nesbitt urges that the Haitian Revolution invented the idea of universal emancipation. He writes, and I quote, though individuals had on occasion imagined universal rights as a pure abstraction, no society had ever been constructed in accord with the axiom of universal emancipation. The construction of a society without slavery, one of a universal and unqualified human right to freedom, properly stands as Haiti's unique contribution to humanity, unquote. These are strong claims that are meant, obviously enough, to recuperate the image of Haiti, to advance a positive and sympathetic understanding of a much maligned revolutionary project. Notably, though, they all, in one way or another, treat universality as an unexamined regulative ideal or normative horizon in relation to which to stake their claim on Haiti's behalf to a privileged, indeed originary, position. Thus, in a curious way and in a new philosophic key, Haiti returns as exception. Far from being the abject outside of universality, Haiti vindicates itself as having the first of righteous claims on it. It may not be hard, therefore, to see what all these formulations unwittingly obscure, namely the conditions of their own construction of Haiti as a theory problem. Thus, we might ask, what is the contemporary discursive conjuncture of questions in which the Haitian Revolution, conceived as universality, can be made to appear as the resolution? I am skeptical then, but even so, my aim here is not to forswear the question of universality. On the contrary, for me too, there is a pertinent question to be asked about Haiti and the politics of the universal, specifically a question about the Haitian Revolution conceived through the protocols of universal history. But I think the relevant question ought to be posed in the following way. What is the theory problem about Haiti that invites casting the story of its revolution as a story of universal history? You can see that, so formulated, the question seeks to steer us away from any idea of the simple self-presence of a connection between the Haitian Revolution and the problem of universality. And inevitably, you might say, this is a question that leads me back to C.L.R. James's The Black Jacobins, since to my mind it is exemplary of books that have accepted this invitation to universal history. As I have said elsewhere in my response to Susan Buck-Morris's provocation in Hegel, Haiti, and Universal History, it is very puzzling to me that the Black Jacobins, though admiringly mentioned in such discussions as hers, is taken up merely as one among other informational sources for the study of the Haitian Revolution, a useful introductory text, rather than as itself a theoretical intervention, and one, moreover, that precisely casts the story of the Haitian Revolution as a story of universal history. In my view, if we are to adequately think the contemporary question of the Haitian Revolution as a problem about the politics of the universal, James's earlier challenge in the Black Jacobins will have to be reconstructed and thereby met and engaged rather than presumed and thereby neglected or disavowed. As we will see, James was not interested in the story of Black emancipation in Haiti as a story of universal human rights, as Dubois and Knight and Nesbitt variously are. But this is clearly not because he was less theory-wise than they are, but rather because his theory problem about Haiti was not the same as theirs. The particular post-Cold War ideological problem space that has redefined human rights as our ultimate horizon, the last utopia, as Samuel Moyne puts it recently, was not his. The problem about 18th century France for James was less a context for thinking about the universality of rights than for thinking about the universality of revolution. Therefore, I want to return to the Black Jacobins, now at a somewhat different angle, though nevertheless connected one of preoccupation, than that which animated my conscripts of modernity, and ask the following questions. How are we to understand the incitement to and the uses of universal history in the Black Jacobins? How, through what narrative and tropological devices does James construct Haiti as a theory problem? What ends are served by his mobilization of an interpretive strategy of universal history to address this theory problem? What, in short, is the question or complex of questions in the Black Jacobins to which a story of the Haitian Revolution, written as universal history, is deemed to constitute an answer? Now, I deliberately frame these questions in this way because part of what seems to me worth exploring here is whether or to what degree one can speak of a specifically narratological structure and effect of universal history. In other words, is universal history to be understood simply as a theoretical or philosophical exercise, that is, an exercise in the systematic deployment of concepts to understand the past? Or might it also be considered a narrative or literary exercise, that is to say, the telling of a story of past, present, future of a certain kind? In drawing this contrast, needless to say, I do not mean to imply that theory and narrative are mutually exclusive, reciprocally impermeable domains, that what are called concepts, say, don't or can't inhabit identifiable story forms, or that narrative is devoid of intrinsic propositional or theory purposes. To the contrary. Take Hegel, for example, the acknowledged master of universal history in the tradition of German idealism, and consider for a moment the contrast between the early Phenomenology of Spirit of 1807 and the later Lectures on the Philosophy of World History of 1837. Both, in a certain sense, preeminent studies in the project of universal history. Undoubtedly, there is a good deal that separates these two definitive texts of Hegel's in terms of style and intent, not to mention their contrasting contexts of publication. But one way of marking the contrast I want to foreground here between narrative and theory is to say that the phenomenology can be described, indeed has been eloquently described, as a quasi-literary demonstration of the difficult spiritual journey of universal freedom, the travail of Bildung, whereas the lectures are perhaps best understood more as a didactic exposition of the categories and structure of world history. If the lectures, to which I'm going to turn in a moment, tend toward a theoretical or propositional account of universal history, the phenomenology is shaped more by a narrative modeling of its dramatic poetics. The contrast here is, of course, obviously meant to be merely heuristic, not dogmatic. It is meant to enable me to wonder out loud whether what we call universal history isn't worth describing, in part at least, as a narrative with a distinctive aesthetic effect, the outcome of literary devices or a mode of emplotment being set to work in order to tell a story of a certain kind, namely a story embodying a longing for overcoming and a horizon of expectation and the rhythm and direction of a persistent, if uneven, movement carrying the overall purpose into effect. In other words, I want to suggest that whatever else it is, universal history is also a romantic art that can be read for the poetics of its narrative drama. In what remains, then, I want to think of the Black Jacobins as putting an idea of universal history to work in its account of the Haitian Revolution. To grasp what idea this is, I have, however, first to sketch in outline, using the account in the lectures on the philosophy of world history, a fragment of Haiti's idea of universal history as the progressive realization of freedom. I want to think of this Hegelian story as emblematic of a certain romantic historicism, not least in its figuration of the world historical individual as the vehicle through which a story of striving and a longing for overcoming can be told. After all, part of the way universal history works in the Black Jacobins is through James's heroic figuration of Toussaint Louverture. What is at stake for James in this figuration? What conceptual political labor does it perform? I think that answering such questions is one important way of trying to grasp the theory problem of Haiti for James and why universal history might have seemed to him an appropriate response to it. Universal history and the ethos of vindication. In many respects, of course, it is Hegel's theory of universal history that summarizes, in a philosophical idiom, the historical consciousness of Romanticism, that simultaneously breaks with the abstract Enlightenment constructivism of, say, Vico or Kant, and endows the sense of history with intrinsic movement and direction, that is to say, with the dynamism of tendency or telos, that is at least one of the hallmarks of universal history. There is perhaps little need to remind ourselves in any detail of the historicist temper of Romanticism, the, quote, sheer excess and extravagance, as Stephen Bann puts it, of the romantic investment in the past, unquote. But it may be as well for our purposes here to foreground the distinctive romantic experience of time, because it will help us to grasp the labor of universal history, as Hegel would definitively describe it, and as James would embody it in the Black Jacobins. This experience of time, the distinctive romantic structure of feeling, to use Raymond Williams's phrase, of temporality, was one in which time is no longer merely an object of extrinsic rational inquiry, but an intrinsic dimension of virtually every aspect of human thought and activity. Historical time has here acquired, its own ethical autonomy, its own self-sufficiency, its own self-movement, its own self-determination, such that the historical subject is now as much lived by history as living in it, such that she or he is no longer the merely potential mistress or master of history, but also simultaneously driven by the force, in Hegel's phrase, of an internal vital principle. I shall argue, moreover, that the ethos of this internal principle of historical consciousness is that of vindication, inasmuch as it presents itself as a principle of perpetual longing and striving to righteously overcome the obstacles that mark the long road to self-realization. Vindication, of course, is also an old trope of black radicalism, one that James will adopt and adapt in the Black Jacobins. Hegel's story of spirit is famously the story both of its divisions and travails and of the metaphysical justice of its eventual triumphs. At the center of his account of the philosophy of world history is, as he puts it, the simple idea of reason, the idea that reason governs the world and that world history is therefore a rational process. This is Hegel's historiographical presupposition. Reason, which is self-originating, self-sufficient, and self-determining, not only brings itself into existence, but carries its own purposes into effect. On the one hand, Hegel maintained, reason is its own sole precondition, and its end is the absolute and ultimate end of everything. And on the other, it is itself the agent which implements and realizes this end, translating it from potentiality into actuality, both in the natural universe and in the spiritual world, that is, in world history. In other words, universal history is the working out of the general design of reason and of the idea that reveals itself in the world. World history is the image and enactment of reason. What is of interest from the point of view of universal history, then, are not the individual situations of history, but the spiritual principle or universal thought that runs through the whole. This universal element, Hegel argues, is not to be found in the world of contingent phenomena, but rather in the unity behind the multitude of particulars. History is inherently a rational process that articulates itself in a ceaseless principle of change, the melancholy of negation and ruin supplanted by rejuvenation and new life, and the intention, the ultimate end that underlies the direction of its movement is the universal idea, and more specifically, the universal idea of human freedom. This is the telos of universal history. In the theater of world history, as Hegel puts it, spirit as self-sufficient striving seeks its realization in the idea of freedom. On this account, the universal end of history consists of spirit's development toward greater and greater self-consciousness, or in its making the world conform to itself, as Hegel puts it in a striking phrase. But what is the means by which the idea or spirit realizes itself in history, the means by which freedom creates a world for itself? If universal freedom is an internal concept belonging to the world of absolute spirit, it has nevertheless to enter the concrete world of contingency, in which, as Hegel says, the actions of men are governed by their needs, passions, and interests, by the attitudes and aims to which these give rise, and by their own character and abilities. And when the world spirit, or the spirit of universal freedom, converges with the substance of a particular individual will, you have an Hegelian world historical individual. For Hegel, these individuals are those who seize upon this higher universal and make it their own end. It is they who realize the end appropriate to the higher concept of spirit. Hegel goes on, quote, "They do not find their aims and vocations in the calm and regular system of the present, in the hallowed order of things as they are. Indeed, their justification does not lie in the prevailing situation, for they draw their inspiration from another source, from the hidden spirit whose hour is near, but which still lies beneath the surface and seeks to break out without yet having attained an existence in the present. For this spirit, Hegel writes, the present world is but a shell which contains the wrong kernel. World historical individuals are men of action, exertion, and conflict, who, however, never act precipitously, but only when, quote, the time is ripe, when the realization of spirit is imminent. These are men, therefore, unconcerned with personal happiness or satisfaction, because far-sighted as they are completely, even blindly, devoted to the coming future, certain that right is on their side. Their actions, Hegel says, are their entire being, and their whole nature and character are determined by their ruling passion. But just as there is a time for the world historical individual, their emergence and flourishing, there is a time for their decline, when, spent of spirit, they are cast aside by history. As Hegel puts it, quote, when their end is attained, they fall aside like empty husks. They may have undergone great difficulties in order to accomplish their purpose, but as soon as they have done so, they die early like Alexander, are murdered like Caesar, or are deported like Napoleon, unquote. In short, Hegel portrays the romantic story of spirit's longing to realize itself as the great arc of a temporal movement, uneven but sure, in which the universal idea embodies itself in the concrete human will of a world historical hero. And against the odds and overcoming the nearsighted finitude of the mere mortals crowding the historical stage, the lonely but undaunted hero, lived only by the irrepressible force of his inner vision, imposes the future onto the present. And when at last the work of spirit is done, when its truth has vindicated itself as the prevailing reason, and when consequently it no longer has need of the hero's services, it casts him aside, indifferent now to his righteous pleas for a just accounting. My argument here, and forgive me for belaboring Hegel, my argument here is that whatever else this is, however authoritative or commanding its propositional virtues, it is also poetry, the literary evocation of the present's longing for a certain future. The Black Jacobins and the poetics of universal history. It will not be hard, I think, to map this Hegelian story directly onto the pages of the Black Jacobins, to see in the rise and fall of its history's movement the labor of the ceaseless principle of spirit striving, to recognize in its figuration of Toussaint Louverture the entry of the universal idea of freedom into a specific conjuncture of self-fashioning and self-determination. Thus, against this background, I won't turn to James's text and put to it the following questions. What is the theory problem about Haiti? Or more precisely, what is the theory problem within which the Haitian Revolution is constructed as the scene of an Hegelian story of the progressive realization of universal spirit? And finally, how and through what narrative strategy or literary device is its effect of universal history produced? Again, I reiterate that my point in raising these questions here is less to put into motion a fully worked out conceptual history than to oblige us to see the necessity of denaturalizing Haiti, to attune us to the connection between Haiti as the object of a theory problem on the one hand, and on the other, of universal history as the mode of its literary theoretical resolution. This is the circumscribed problem at hand for me. Speaking somewhat schematically here for the sake of my argument, and thus glossing over a densely complex history, I suggest that the theory problem about Haiti for the Black Jacobins was constituted by a number of intersecting discursive contexts that made the universal history of self-determination and revolution perhaps the compelling vindicationist answer to the questions of racial and colonial domination. It scarcely needs rehearsing that the central problem organizing the construction of Africans and peoples of African descent in the context of the scientific racism of the last decades of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th concerned their fundamental humanity, defined in terms of, quote, civilized achievement. Of what were black people capable? What was their relative level of intelligence? What had they accomplished? What hope was there of progress? The colonial question during these years was, of course, connected to that of race and humanity, but it centered its attention principally on the capacity of the colonized for self-government, for sovereignty. Were the colonized capable of ruling themselves without supervision, benevolent or otherwise? How would their readiness for self-government be determined? Indeed, could the colonized really ever be entrusted with all the rights and privileges of political responsibility that were taken for granted among civilized states? These were ominous but far-reaching questions in an era in which, as Gerrit Gong has shown, a certain, quote, standard of civilization governed the idea of international community. And within the terms of this standard, Haiti had long been figured as an exemplary signifier, the paradigmatic instance of the horror and failure of black self-determination. One has only to think, choosing more or less at random, of Hesketh Pritchard's travel memoir, Where Black Rules White, published in 1900, to grasp the essential structure of the Haiti problem to which a vindicationist response might be offered. An adventure with a familiar late Victorian taste for racialized travel. James Anthony Froude was only a more accomplished version of the same desire. Pritchard arrived in Haiti in 1899 to probe, as he put it, the mystery and fascination of the Black Republic, where, as he said, since Dessalines' famous wholesale massacre of the remaining French men, women, and children, the island's interiority had been virtually closed to white eyes. But the real question framing Pritchard's interest was the one that organized his final chapter, significantly titled, Can the Negro Rule Himself? This is the question toward which the entire travelogue is oriented. And for Pritchard, Haiti provided not only the best, but also the conclusive answer to it. For in Haiti, as he put it lyrically, and I'm quoting, the Negro has had his chance, a fair field and no favor. He has had the most fertile and beautiful of the Caribbees for his own. He has had the advantage of excellent French laws. He inherited a made country with Cap-Haïtien for its Paris. Here was a wide land sown with prosperity, a land with wood, water, towns, and plantations, and in the midst of it, the black man was turned loose to work out his own salvation, unquote. But what has the Negro made of this fair chance, asked Pritchard rhetorically. The answer is not hard to anticipate. Quote, at the end of 100 years, at the end of 100 years of trial, how does the black man govern himself? What progress has he made? Absolutely none, unquote. This is an all too familiar theory of Haiti. Still, to properly appreciate the discursive context of intervention of the Black Jacobins, it is important to remind ourselves that this Haiti idea, Haiti as the instantiation of the incapacity of blacks for sovereignty, of their continuing need of the firm paternal hand of political guidance, was not only an ideologically prominent one in the late 19th century, and early 20th century as well, but also a materially consequential one inasmuch as it undergirded the political context in which Woodrow Wilson, in flagrant contradiction of his stated commitment to the self-determination of small states, would invade on 28 July 1915. The thin pretext for the landing of the Marines at Port-au-Prince was the chaos that followed the assassination of President Guillaume Sam and the need to protect US interests from the ongoing political instability. But US designs on the Haitian treasury and the strategic territory of Môle Saint-Nicolas were transparent enough to many observers, and the reduction of Haitians once again to virtual colonial subjugation was carried out with open brutality and undisguised racialized contempt. The occupation offered a virtually unobstructed field for military domination and rampant economic exploitation. But as Michael Dash and Mary Render have variously shown, once the resistance was subdued, it provided also the controlled occasion for a veritable explosion of writing by white Americans in which Haiti was constructed as a sort of looking glass, as the primitive scene of a racialized and sexualized desire. Now, against the direction of this whole body of white writing, there had long been a tradition of vindicationist counter-discourse in New World Black writing, in which Haiti was celebrated as the vanguard of Black liberation and Black self-determination. In a certain sense, the Black Jacobins is simply a distinct instance of this Black intellectual tradition. The best examples of this vindicationist writing in the 19th century were undoubtedly the 1857 work of the emigrationist and missionary James Theodore Holly, entitled A Vindication of the Capacity of the Negro Race for Self-Government and Civilized Progress, demonstrated by historical events of the Haitian Revolution, and the speech given by Frederick Douglass at the Haiti Pavilion of the Chicago World's Fair in January 1893. Less than 2 decades later, in a conjuncture marked by a rapidly coalescing Black internationalism, the Great War and its cruel aftermaths for African Americans and West Indians, the rising tide of Pan-Africanism, the growth of Garvey's UNIA and other militant organizations. The US occupation, in the US occupation, Haiti would become a flashpoint for Black cultural political consciousness. Already in August 1915, an outraged W.E.B. Du Bois had written in protest to President Wilson, seeking assurances, and doubtlessly receiving none, had written a scathing editorial in the October issue of Crisis, denouncing the invasion as a racial violation of the sovereignty of a sister state. But in the wake of the racial violence of the Red Summer of 1919, nothing would focus the minds of concerned African Americans and others too, including the US government itself, on Haiti, as much as James Weldon Johnson's measured and learned expose of the abuses of the US Marines, entitled Self-Determining Haiti, published in 1920. Yet, in these years, Haiti was still largely the object of a cautious discourse of Black accomplishment and outraged solidarity. By the early 1930s, however, a younger, more militant generation of internationalist Black writers and artists began to produce a grittier, less appeasing, and on the whole more historical approach to Haiti. Among these were Langston Hughes and Jacob Lawrence. Also among them was Paul Robeson, who would collaborate with James in 1936 in a stage adaptation of the story of Toussaint Louverture. In short, then, by the 1930s, the Haitian Revolution had come to be rendered as a crucial site of Black inheritance and of the claim of Black self-determination. Connected to this problematic of Black sovereignty, there is at least one other conceptual and ideological context that structures the predicament to which the Black Jacobins responds. This is the Marxist context of world revolution that animated the interwar years of the early 20th century. In the 1930s, as Stalin consolidated his position and liquidated the old Bolsheviks one after another, the meaning of revolution was very much in question, and the world revolutionary movement coalescing around the exiled and beleaguered Trotsky was seeking to redescribe its history and indeed its world historical project. As is well known, James was drawn to these circles, becoming himself a center of Marxist discussion. It will be remembered, too, that the other seminal book that occupied James in these years and that appeared just before the Black Jacobins was his study of the international communist movement, World Revolution. Moreover, George Padmore's break with the Communist International in 1935 over the colonial question and his move from Moscow to London attuned James to the tension between socialist and anti-colonial struggles. The US occupation of Haiti had been a live issue for Padmore. In 1930, he had written a critical essay on the December 1929 revolt in Haiti and its bloody repression in the London-based communist periodical Labour Monthly, and in 1931 had extended his critique in a short pamphlet, Haiti, an American Slave Colony, published in Moscow. In other words, a crucial dimension of the problem space in which Haiti came to be constructed, or perhaps cathected as a theory object for James in the 1930s, was the question of placing Black emancipation and anti-colonial revolution in the wider problematic of world socialist revolution. On the whole, then, taking these discursive contexts together, the theory problem or theory question within which a certain narrative of the Haitian Revolution appears to offer the potential conceptual ideological resources for an answer might be formulated as follows. How to tell the vindicationist story of Black self-determination as an intrinsic part of the universal history of world revolution? Or to put the critical demand slightly differently, how to shape a story in which the figure of Black humanity, reduced for centuries to the abjection of racialized enslavement, will embody a world historical longing and the agency that makes possible the realization of universal emancipation. These are large myth-making questions, but they organize, I think, the challenge that the Black Jacobins aims to meet. But how does James produce the effect of universal history in the Black Jacobins? The dramatic movement from travail to realization that maps the arc of spirit in history. For if, as I am suggesting, universal history is partly at least a narrative or aesthetic effect, we have to inquire into the literary devices, the mode of emplotment, the figuration of character, the tropological strategies he employs to accomplish this. Readers of the Black Jacobins will recall that James was nothing if not profoundly self-conscious of the poetics of writing, the past into the present, of shaping the content of the form of historical representation. Indeed, readers will recall the tension James deliberately stages in the celebrated preface to the first edition between concept and artifice, between, as he put it, the science, that is the analytic, and the art, that is the story of history. In some sense, as I have suggested, this was the productive tension between the competing models that were among his principal sources of historiographic inspiration, namely Jules Michelet's History of the French Revolution and Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, both concerned, remember, with writing revolution as universal history, the one tending more toward an analytic of historical progress and the other more toward an aesthetic of historical narration. If Michelet and Trotsky aimed to produce their respective revolutions, French and Russian, as realizations of a principle of universality, this too, I argue, is James's challenge in writing the history of the Haitian Revolution, namely writing anti-colonial revolution, the self-emancipation of the Black colonized, as universality. And as with Michelet's and Trotsky's histories, James's principal objective in the Black Jacobins is not to recount the basic details of the historical unfolding of the Saint-Domingue insurrection in all their professional completeness, though clearly these details are scarcely unimportant to him. Rather, James's objective is to use these events to emplot a story of the self-emancipation of the slaves as an initiative of universal emancipation and therefore of universal history. Famously, and in striking contrast with both Michelet and Trotsky, the principal way in which James seeks to construct this effect of universal history in the account of the Haitian Revolution is through the device of heroic figuration of his main protagonist, Toussaint Louverture. For James, memorably, Toussaint is not merely a concrete individual with an empirically determinate biography and specifiable career. He is primarily a world historical figure, embodying the progressive self-movement of spirit from the doomed world of slavery into the coming dispensation of freedom. James's Toussaint embodies the direction of reason in history. The story of the Haitian Revolution in the Black Jacobins, therefore, can be read as the story of spirit striving toward a higher self-consciousness, as the movement through which the potentiality of spirit, the ethical substance of universality, realizes itself or is translated into historical actuality. It is this movement that shapes the great arc of the book and the ceaseless principle that drives the momentum of the narrative drama, from the melancholy tyrannies and tortures and debasements and inhumanities of the Middle Passage and plantation enslavement to the joyous opening of the project of freedom as self-determination. Toussaint Louverture, in this respect, is the Hegelian vehicle through which the journey of spirit comes to self-realization. It is Toussaint, in other words, who is able to seize universality and make it one with himself. Whether or not old Toussaint of Breda ever read the Abbé Raynal, the hermeneutic point of that scene of reading in the opening chapter of the Black Jacobins when we first meet our protagonist is for James not merely to indicate his hero's induction into the radical enlightenment, though it is that too, undoubtedly. It is to show, within that steadily rising curve of his narrative, the moment when universality enters into the concrete particular of Toussaint's historical life and stamps upon it the name of his destiny. For James's Toussaint, the inherited slave world of Saint-Domingue was, in Hegel's apt metaphor, but a shell containing the wrong kernel. This is the ground of Toussaint's embodied insight. And as James shows it to us with the deft hand of a novelist, it is not simply that Toussaint recognizes the falseness or irrationality or wrongness of his world. It is that the new world, the future to come, is already a faintly glimmering dawn in the abject night of the old. Toussaint inhabits this historical hinge, and what he awakens to is the ripeness of his moment. Unlike the other leaders of the rapidly unfolding insurrection, Jacques Dessalines, for example, or Henri Christophe, James's Toussaint embodies the inward self-consciousness of this ripening of time and its implications for his destiny and those of his fellows. This is the Hegelian meaning, then, of that pivotal scene in chapter 4, the San Domingo Masses begin, of Toussaint's initial hesitation in 1791 to join the insurrection. It is not doubt, it is not fear, it is not servility. Ever master of himself, as James puts it, this hesitation marks the hero's apprehension of the yet unripeness of the moment, the yet untimeliness of the time, and his certain conviction that his entry into world history, however seemingly obscure, will be dictated solely by the inner vision of the rightness of the time. Similarly, James has us see that, with one exception, Toussaint's various negotiations with the Spanish, the English, the Americans, the French, the plantocracy, the mulattoes, were never compromises of principle. They were mere politics, mere means to an end that would be larger than the sum of their disparate parts. They were not dictated by his Europhile inclinations, as some would argue. They were driven by his drive to serve the inner vision, the idea of the higher truth planted in him by the design of universal history. And finally, when the work of spirit has completed itself in and through Toussaint Louverture, we witness the progressive movement of reason in history no longer corresponding with his concrete practice. He begins to falter, to busy himself, as James laments, with sawing off the branch on which he was sitting. In a slowly gathering alteration of historical forces and conditions, the world now no longer conforms to his indomitable will. There are revolts and subversions on all sides. He has lost touch with the popular pulse. He even feels obliged, out of desperation, to execute his much-beloved Moïse, in whom he senses a rival, the presence of a new angel of history. Indeed, Toussaint has now been overtaken by the very spirit of freedom he himself has gifted to the world. And like all world historical figures at the end of their journey, he will be tossed aside, falling by the way like an empty husk in Hegel's image, leaving the way for others to take up the work left to be done. Writing of the famous battle at the fort of Crête-à-Pierrot in March 1802, one of the deciding battles of the Haitian Revolution, when Dessalines proved himself the man of the moment, James is unsentimental in his description of Toussaint's loss of historical direction. And I quote, "He seemed still to be hoping that if he defeated Leclerc, Bonaparte would see reason and the valuable connection with France he maintained. But the days for that were over. Dessalines had proclaimed the word independence. Toussaint was still thinking in terms of the decree of February 4th, 1794, by which the Revolutionary French Convention abolished slavery in the colonies. The Black Revolution had passed him by," unquote. My coda. Now, my aim here has not been to set down exhaustively, even nearly so, the whole dramatic labor of C.L.R. James's exercise in writing the Haitian Revolution as universal history in the Black Jacobins. What I want you to principally see in my account is not merely this labor in itself, as though it could be disconnected from an historicizable complex of questions. Rather, what I want you to see is the connection between the construction of Haiti as a certain kind of conceptual ideological object, a certain kind of theory problem, structured around race, colonialism, revolution, and self-determination, and the mobilization of a narrative strategy of universal history that works by showing, rather more perhaps than didactically explaining, the unfolding overcoming of the besetting conundrums and the realization of reason in a specific history. This, one might call, the literary political project of universal history that James sets to work through the vindication of his world historical hero, Toussaint Louverture. Whether or not, in organizing his historical narrative in this way, James is writing the Haitian Revolution into a conception of temporality that remains usable in our own historical time, is a question, I would suggest, that will have to be formulated, not a conclusion that can be assumed a priori. One way or another, it was precisely an objective of conscripts of modernity to put this question into critical circulation. Part of the disfavor, memorably, into which universal history fell during the theory wars of around the 1990s, turned, of course, on its grand, often Eurocentric assumption of a metaphysical foundation that propositionally guaranteed the possibility and direction of the general good of universal freedom. And in the political doldrums that marked these years, the end of Bandung, the end of socialism, the reconstitution of the contours of imperial power, and so on, a good deal of post-metaphysical work has gone into dismantling the philosophical hubris of that discourse of freedom. But alas, post-structuralism may indeed, in its own theory conceit, have thrown the proverbial baby out with the unwanted bathwater. in the sense that it may have disabled its own poetics of emancipation, its own ability to think imaginatively a future at the limits of the present. But if universal history can be detached from the demand for propositional truth, if, that is to say, we can recognize in the story form of universal history a normative strategy that secures a poetic truth, perhaps we will feel under less theory pressure to stifle and dispense with the emancipationist longings that its mode of emplotment has so earnestly interpellated us as potential subjects of freedom. In any case, offering us this challenge in Haiti's name is, to my mind, one of the unending provocations of C.L.R. James's The Black Jacobins. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. Very rich, and evocative, imaginative reading of the Black Jacobins and the poetics of universal history. But it's my sort of honour and privilege in many ways to be here and to have the opportunity to be able to continue our conversation about some of the issues around the Black Jacobins. And the talk, though, covered a huge wide range, so I don't want to spend too long myself in this. I want to open it up, because I'm sure the talk touched on questions relating to representations of Haiti today, sort of Haiti as an anthropological object, I think as you put it, and collective memory of Haiti and the Haitian Revolution. So I just wanted to, as a historian, I just wanted to maybe perhaps...
As an historian, is that what you...
As a historian, yes. I just wanted to maybe defend some of my fellow historians who you mentioned, Laurent Dubois and Franklin Knight, and also I don't know if you've seen Robin Blackburn's recent work, The American Crucible, which touched on this question of universal human rights. I think Robin Blackburn's work's sort of subtitled sort of Slavery, Enlightenment and Human Rights, and I just wondered if you could maybe say a little bit more about that, because I agree with you with respect to the danger of instrumentalizing Haiti out of its context, and I agree with you that James and the Black Jacobins was not concerned with so much with universal human rights as universal revolution. But perhaps, I mean, for example, the Haitian Constitution of 1805 did talk about the sacred rights of man, and they did kind of in a sense they saw themselves as kind of redeeming and vindicating that, certainly in 1805. So I just wondered how you saw sort of, if you want to say any more about sort of universal human rights and the Haitian Revolution.
Thanks, Christian. I don't have a lot more to say about that. I don't want you to hear me as being, I don't want to spend a lot of time being critical of these historians. What interests me is the straightforward way in which Haiti is now employed as a kind of exception to illustrate paradigmatically the emergence of human rights. And what seems to me these historians don't do is not so much problematize the Haitian Revolution, and all of them are in many ways substantively important writers of that period, but to examine systematically their own ideological and discursive context. What are the contemporary questions that make Haiti appear to us as a paradigmatic story of the making of human rights? There is something about the present and about the present's reorganization of the horizon of historical progress, if you like, in which human rights has now been asserted as the last utopia, as Sam Moyne puts it, and Haiti is reinscribed as a new kind of exceptional origin of that story. It seems to me that there is that kind of self-reflexiveness that needs to be put to work, and I think that if that were the case, then one couldn't simply dismiss or set aside or footnote James as merely a useful introductory text to the story of the Black Jacobins, because James doesn't write the story of the Haitian Revolution toward the story of human rights.
Thank you. Yeah, if we move on to the Black Jacobins then, which is more. And I just wondered, you know, Conscripts of Modernity in 2004. I just wondered if you wanted to. You don't really talk so much about. There's clearly been a slight shift in your own thinking about this question. Slightly. I mean, in Conscripts of Modernity, your focus is on more Carlyle and sort of Toussaint Louverture as a great man of history, and you have Hegel in there a little bit, but you don't kind of centre Hegel in the way you do. However, on the other hand, it's more. I just take the kind of more optimism, perhaps, coming through in your recent talk when you talk about the importance of Haiti to think about questions of race, colonialism, revolution, self-determination. And given we've got, you know, the Arab Spring that's erupted in the last few years, questions of return of revolution to sort of a historical stage, if you like, even if perhaps it hasn't quite reached, unfortunately, Tahrir Square hasn't quite reached the contemporary Caribbean, perhaps in that sense, still US dominated. But I just wondered if there was something slightly, if you wanted to say something, how you saw this move towards sort of, you know, any more about what you still see in Conscripts of Modernity, or in terms of romanticism. There's still huge continuities, but I just wondered if there's been a slight shift in your own thinking.
I think that in Conscripts, my preoccupation was to draw a contrast between modes of historical employment, as between romance and tragedy in Hayden White's, I think, very important terms. And so the emphasis, and to show the ways in which James has a sense of an historical conjuncture that makes, in his rewriting or in his introduction of the new paragraphs into the 1963 edition, James has a sense that tragedy, that a poetics of tragedy is more apt to describe the contours of the Haitian Revolution. So in some way, the accent of the story, of my story in Conscripts of Modernity is to underline the place of tragedy in a criticism of the present. Yeah, this essay, in some way, as I say at the beginning, partly grows out of the provocation of Susan Buck Morris's book, around which there has been a good deal of debate, and I myself have published a direct response to it. But there seemed to be something else at work, because in her account, part of the problem about the Black Jacobins as a text was its lack of theory. It was narrative, but not theory, as though narrative itself didn't carry poetic implications that were crucial for understanding the arc of history. And so I wanted then to return to the story, to pick up some of the shadows of my telling in Conscripts, and to pull out of it, to sort of bracket out the tragedy question, and to focus more on what it is James is doing in telling the story in the way he tells the story.
Okay. Well, I agree with the importance that you give for Black Jacobins as a key text in terms of thinking about theory, as well as just just another historical, a historical account of the Haitian Revolution. I suppose this is where my most sort of skepticism is over your, and this comes back again to Hegel, because it seems to be James, in some ways, read Hegel. Hegel was very important to James from the 1940s onwards, when he went to America and during the Second World War and the crisis of Trotskyism. And if you look at works, a little pamphlet he wrote in 1947 called Dialectical Materialism and the Fate of Humanity, or Notes on Dialectics, he brings in Hegelian categories such as universality. In some ways, he's a sort of a pioneer of universal history, and if people wanted to make him one, in his writings in the 1940s, he brings in Hegel. But I suppose you probably see this one coming, is that he doesn't, by 1938, my sense is that James hasn't really particularly engaged with Hegel. Right. And so that's I suppose, yeah, I just wondered, I think there's much that's really, evocative about your interpretation of Toussaint Louverture through this, and clearly he is not just a world historical figure. He is this, James is clearly stressing the importance of Toussaint. But if I could just quote one little passage from Black Jacobins, just before I'll let you. This will be my last question, I think, before I'll open it up, because I don't want to abuse the chair. But he's writing towards the end, and this is a Black consul. He talks about Toussaint, and James says, firm as was his grasp of reality, old Toussaint looked beyond San Domingo with a boldness of imagination surpassed by no contemporary. I mean, he goes on about how Toussaint wanted to try and liberate Africa from the slave trade by building, an army and so on. But then he says, okay, he was already 55. What spirit was it that moved him? Ideas do not fall from heaven. The great revolution had propelled him out of his humble joys and obscure destiny. And the trumpets of its heroic period rang ever in his ears. In him, born a slave and the leader of slaves, the concrete realization of liberty, equality, and fraternity was the womb of ideas and the springs of power, which overflowed their narrow environment and embraced the whole of the world. It seems to me that what James is saying there, as he's talking about spirit and Toussaint, is that he's saying it's really the real hero, the real importance of the Haitian Revolution is the revolution itself. It's the revolutionary spirit of the Haitian people that have changed Toussaint, and in some ways, rather than some sort of Hegelian spirit striving from above that's driving Toussaint. That's, it's more coming from below, and Toussaint embodying that spirit.
That's a very Christian question.
Sorry.
So, and again, I should have anticipated
yes.
that question. I'm going to leave to you the account of James's direct influence of Hegel Marx on James in the 1930s, 1940s. I agree with you that it is unlikely that James read Hegel, either the phenomenology or the lectures at the time that he was writing. It may also be a question how much Marx he had read by then too. But one of the things that James says, as you well know, that by the time he encountered Marx and Hegel, he already knew them. And he knew them partly because he was steeped in the kind of the German idealist influenced Victorianism of the 19th century. Thus, Carlyle is important to him, the way in which Carlyle writes history. And Carlyle writes history with an air to German idealism. Yeah. Okay. So it seems to me that James is an inheritor. Is an inheritor of a certain way of thinking about great men in history. So, but you may be right that the weight of James's Hegelianism comes later. So I don't want to be heard here to be suggesting that there's a direct influence. I merely want to say that there is a paradigm here that one can recognize in the arc of the storytelling of the Black Jacobins. What was the second part of the question?
It was, I suppose it was more about the, I don't know, perhaps the
oh, have I changed my...
yeah, that was one question earlier. I mean...
which I have evaded.
Yeah, yes. Were you? I suppose. Are you inspired at all by the recent events in terms of the Arab Spring at all? In the sense that there's any kind of in your conscripts, you're very much talking about tragedy, and it's these new tragic post-colonial times we live in today. I suppose I suppose I was just trying to think, in your attack at the end on, or your critique of the conceit of post-structuralism and the limitations of post-structuralism as a way of thinking about the world today, and it's turned towards sort of thinking about universal revolution, and I don't know, I just detected, perhaps it was wrong, I just detected a kind of, perhaps a slight shift towards
I mean, I hope you're
cheerful.
wrong. I hope you're wrong, but I think there is a slight shift, and I think a shift here really of emphasis. I think that there is a particular context of intervention that conscripts of modernity is concerned to enter into, and to sort of pry open some space in order to think against some of the progressivist conceits of the way in which the romantic art of history is put to a certain kind of work. So I want to enter there and to take issue with some of the implications of that story, and to that reading of colonialism and its aftermaths, let's say. So here I think I have a somewhat different motivation, and it's a motivation that aims at not rescuing universality. I am not at all myself about universality. I don't think, not yet, anyway. But to say that there is something interesting about the way in which the question of universality works in James, and that James is not merely naive in his own mobilization of that strategy. There's something that there's a way of reading that story of universality in which we can recognize the question that James uses it to answer. And I think that reading history in that way, of reading history in terms of the problem spaces that throw up questions to which people produce different kinds of answers, is important to the way in which I think we should think about history.
Okay. So we're in a completely new historical time now.
No. I am not sure that we are. No. I am not sure yet.
No,
I am not sure that we are quite yet.
Okay. Okay. I think it would be a good time to open it up. Yeah, if people would just raise their hands, and then I'll as indicate, and then I'll call people. Yes, so at the front. Yes.
Yeah, okay. I was just going to say that what you seem to indicate is perhaps a situation of chickens and eggs here.
Chickens and eggs.
Yeah, because in fact, of course, Toussaint did make the point himself during his lifetime that he was very much aware of what was going on in Europe at the time. I mean, you cite Napoleon, the influence that he felt he had in relation to that. In a sense, Hegel embodied the spirit of the time with his ideas, I mean, in terms of the poetry of revolution. And I rather think that because he lived there, in a sense, James is commenting on an earlier situation. Do you see what I'm saying? In other words, true, he may not have read Hegel at the time when he actually wrote the book, but Toussaint might well have been influenced by the whole idea of revolution in the spirit of the time, the sort of Hegelian ideas that were prevalent at the time, you know. I mean, in that sense, or the romanticism, if you like, of revolution. Because he did represent a form of romanticism which Dessalines didn't. In a sense, I see Toussaint as a form of poetry, if you like, of revolution. And I see Dessalines as the science of it, if you like, the actual acting out, the inevitable closure, you know. Because, I mean, the point made by Toussaint, by C.L.R. James in the book, was they were both very important, weren't they? I mean, they both were required for the Haitian Revolution to come to its conclusion, tragic as it may well have been.
I wonder whether Toussaint, I think, in some sense, yes, embodied the spirit of his times, but not on Hegelian. I mean, not on Hegelian spirit directly, historically. After all, this phenomenology is 1807. Yes, but
rather than trying to get down to Hegel,
right.
I'm trying to widen it to include a sort of a general feeling at the time.
Yes.
Hegel was basically a child of his time as well, basically.
Indeed, indeed.
Trying to get at.
Yes, I mean, I think that
I'm trying to winkle this out myself, actually.
Uh-huh.
Thank
I'm not sure. I mean, I think yes, I'm not sure what you mean by chicken and egg, but I do think that it is the case
well, I mean,
that...
now, like, and after reading of things, you know, I mean, it's obviously important. You can't use, I mean, to actually say that you've read it, to try...
Yeah, oh, I see what you mean.
You see what I'm saying? In a sense, we're dealing with closure here, aren't we? We're dealing with closure, revolutionary focus of the tightening lens on human rights rather than, you know, look at the Arab Spring thing. People are worried about that sort of thing. They want that to come to what the West would like to see happen, basically, which is a form of acceptable human rights as part of the general background that we all live in now. But I see there's a kind of a tightening, sort of an astigmatism, a sort of a tightening of a kind of optical.
Right. I mean, I think that there is perhaps a really interesting story, historical story, to be told about the emergence of the preoccupation with human rights that goes to the bicentenary of the French Revolution, in which many people, or a number of people, argued in the wake of it that there was no mention of Haiti, and the emergence of a number of texts in which France is centered as the origin of the story of human rights. And this is work that is attempting, of Dubois and Knight and Nesbitt, to in some way subvert the Euro-centered character of that story. So I think that there is something really important for us to ask ourselves. What is it that we read history in terms of? And these are people who are reading history in terms of presuppositions about the place or the horizon of human rights, and where James was writing that history in terms of his assumptions about the horizon of revolution. And that contrast, I think, is enormously important for us to think about our own present as a political present.
There's someone up at there. Yeah.
Hi. Just thinking about conscripts of modernity, I agree with your assessment of the Black Jacobin being about being a tragic epic in this sense. To what extent do you feel it fits in with other writings of Haiti in the early 20th century that, particularly from the African American communities, which stated Haiti as a form of, in the 1920s and 30s, as a form of arrested development from a glorious start? To what extent do you see?
Who are you thinking about specifically? Like Weldon Johnson, or who are you thinking of specifically?
So things that were coming out of Harlem, in some respects, but ideas as well from Langston Hughes as well.
Right. I mean, we'd have to be a little specific here too. But I mean, I think that, as I alluded in the paper, there is an interesting, quite rapidly evolving shifts, historical context, and shifts within that context from the end of the 19th century, when you do have people writing about Haiti in various ways. I mean, people like Frederick Douglass, for example, and in a very cautious, progressivist kind of civilizationist language, to the time back to Langston Hughes, which are much more subversive kinds of radical critiques. Even Du Bois's 1915, I think it was 1915 in The Crisis, is a very cautious kind of evocation of a sister state to the U.S. rather than a celebration of the great self-determinist struggle of the former slaves in Saint-Domingue. So there is an interesting arc there that requires, I think, far more nuanced teasing out than I have done here. I think it's a really interesting period from roughly the end of the US Civil War, the end of the 1860s, and the beginnings of kind of missionary immigrationist discourse, to the radical edge Arna Bontemps, for example, Langston Hughes, in the end of the 1920s, early 1930s, who have a much more grittier, much edgier, much angrier kind of response to the way in which Haiti is imagined. But I think that is work that I would look forward to you doing.
Yeah.
I'll get on it.
Okay. Someone at the front.
Thank you for that paper. It was really provocative, and there's lots to think about. This isn't my century or my hemisphere, but I just wanted to ask you something about some really interesting things you said at the end of the paper about sort of socialism. And I was thinking about your previous...
Socialism.
I was just thinking, you talk about universal history and world history, but I was just thinking at the end more about international history and internationalist history. And again, with regards to some of your comments on post-structuralism, about comparativist history, and how it seems a lot of those processes are happening here anyway. So I'd just like to ask you to speak a little bit more about them. With you specifically, I was just really interested in how you think your perspective on this work has been framed by the fact that a lot of your earliest publications were actually on South Asia, and that this is you coming back to an area. And I'm just thinking, with you and James, what are the traces of experiences and thoughts about other parts in the world of these narratives which can be strung up as a discourse between the Caribbean and Europe? So I was thinking with you specifically, you did publish on South Asia and then came back, and I'm just wondering, was Haiti mentioned in South Asian anti-colonial discourses you came across, or how easy is it to shake off the experience of anti-colonialism in South Asia when you experience it, or come back to it elsewhere? And with James, you talk about socialism. I'm just wondering, he's writing at a period when people are performing anti-colonial revolutions differently worldwide, and I'm just wondering, I don't know the work in depth at all. Are there many traces in his work of contemporary revolutions that are finding their ways back into his historical readings? So just different types of history beyond the universal in the world that might be playing through here.
Thank you. Those are fascinating, very different sorts of questions. So yes, it is true, of course, that for close on 2 decades, my scholarly preoccupations are in South Asia, in Sri Lanka in particular, and that's what I'm writing about, and that's the research that I'm doing. And there is in some sense, a break, and I begin to think about the Caribbean. Very straightforwardly, no, I can't. There is not really there is no direct. I mean, there are direct links between me and Sri Lanka, but they are personal ones. But there's no direct link between anti-colonialism, so far as I know, in South Asia, and certainly not in British Ceylon, and the Haiti question. But there is a good deal that I don't know in how much detail I can go into it at the moment, or how coherent I can be in trying to dredge up or reconstruct what some of these connections might be. But there is a kind of contrast effect, I think, that is playing in me. And one of the things that I have been very interested in is the way in which you see, the way in which one can move in relation to figure and ground, in the way in which one engages objects, whether objects of political or historical inquiry. And so when I was doing my research in Sri Lanka, I was fascinated by people who had, as it were, done work in some kind of cultural, political, ideological, existential elsewhere, and who returned to a more personal space with that work, as it were, ever working in the background and in the interstices of what they thought about. And how to reconstruct that, I am not sure. There is an ongoing debate in my work with subaltern studies. And as I've always said, conscripts of modernity, there is an interlocutor there that's Partha Chatterjee's work. and his own sense of what the critique of the colonial past ought to be in relation to how one figures a subaltern historiography and writing the past in relation to the present. And so those questions and the ways in which those questions, as he understood them, depend on, for example, among other things, depend on the presence of a much transformed but nevertheless existing pre-colonial set of formations which didn't exist in the Caribbean. So that contrast was enormously interesting to me, that the Caribbean begins with the destruction of the native population and the construction in the space of their absence of a modern slave plantation society. And that was a preoccupation of James, certainly. Not so much in the body of the black, I mean, Christian will tell me if I'm getting my James wrong here, but not in the body of the Black Jacobins so much as in the appendix and in some of the other writings much later when he returns himself to the Caribbean. So that figure and ground movement, that sense of the contrast effect that can feed into the way in which one conceives of one's analytical objects is something that I think about a lot. I suspect that my answer is not a very good one. You had thank you.
Yeah.
Can I add my thanks to the wonderful presentation, which was very rich and
thank you very much.
Spinning for days. I think one observation and then one question. I think the observation relates to this issue about painting or the construction of the Haitian Revolution as being a counterpoint to what you call Eurocentric historical writing. I'm an international lawyer, and I think one of the fascinating things for me is that the reason why Haiti is of such profound interest in the scholars you mentioned, we use in our international law class, is not so much Eurocentrism as the silence that is presented in Western texts of international law. Now that silence may be a sign or symbol of Eurocentrism, or maybe something distinct from it. But I think that the idea of reclaiming the episode of revolution as an instance of self-determination is a profound claim on the silence, or a rebuttal of that silence.
Right.
And what one might describe as a sort of whiteness of self-determination in the telling of the story of that concept in international law. I guess my question is the issue of what we mean when we're talking about universal history.
Mm-hmm.
What is universal? Is it the material we're talking about, or is it the audience? Because something tells me that in James's work, he was addressing himself to a particular audience, and every history needs an audience. So when you were talking earlier on about Wilson, President Wilson, to me, the way I've actually structured the material of my understanding of history is Wilson was entirely consistent when you look at his response to Japan's proposal in 1919 at the Versailles Conference on the League of Nations. The Japanese proposed a clause to go in the Covenant of the League of Nations on racial equality. And Wilson led the charge to say, no, we don't want a clause of that nature in the document, mainly because there was no way that any empire could continue with a clause on racial equality. So to me, his whole role in the Haitian episode from 1915 that you mentioned was entirely consistent. But that is a construction of history that is entirely dependent on the audience, on who's reading history. And I think what James gives us is the idea of the fragmentation of that audience.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting. Very, very interesting questions. Particularly because I myself am interested in both the story of international law international law's autobiography of international law, and the ways in which we have international law appears so unavoidable in thinking about so many the domains. And I am particularly interested in the story of self-determination. So this is very interesting to me. I don't know that any of the three historians that I mentioned are themselves interested specifically in international law, though there is one international lawyer, Siba Grovogi, who is writing writing a book, I think, on again the Haitian Revolution as one of the origins of human rights, and there, perhaps more rigorously than in these writers, the international law story may be foregrounded. But I agree with you that that these are writers who are responding to the question of the silence, absolutely. And therefore, Michel Rolfe-Trouillot's book, Silence in the Past, is central to all of these texts, and is in many ways the implicit or explicit interlocutor for most of the contemporary work of any value on rethinking Haiti, bless his memory. So I think that there is a question of recuperation, of unsilencing that this work is doing, and I am an admirer of it for that. And I am, and don't get me wrong, an admirer of this work in general, but I want this work to do something slightly other than it's doing, as well as what it's doing. I want it to tell us something about the ideological history of the human rights, of the demand of human rights, or of human rights as the horizon of our desire, and why it is that reading of the present ought to frame the story of the past. So I want them to be a little bit more reflexive about the present in relation to which they cast or recast the story of the past. Because James is also doing recuperative work. I'm simply saying that James is recuperating that work toward a different horizon. The second question you raise, what is universal history, is very interesting indeed, very, very interesting indeed. Because there is, as you suggest, there's a question about audience, and I want to come to that in just a moment. But in Hegel, there is a tension around the question of what is universal history. There is a tension between universal history as understood, as he puts it in the book, world history, that is the history of everywhere, as it were, the collective history that is obviously cast in a certain arc in which Europe has a certain status and standing. Or is universal history the product of an internal, animating, generative spirit? It is that gives it its universality. It's not the additive character of adding, of accumulating objects and places and stories, but the internal engine that will make particulars, that will make singularities appear in the world in the service of something greater than themselves. And there is a tension, I think, in Hegel around how we might understand that. And I think the more valuable Hegel, even if it's the one that we ought to think about critically, is the latter. Wilson, I don't know. I mean, I think that Wilson is a figure that I want to do a lot more work on, and I use him merely here rhetorically to simply install a figure against whom Du Bois writes critically about. I completely agree with you that his conception of self-determination in the latter part of the First World War and feeding into Versailles remains consistent. It is rejected by the U.S. Congress, and the League of Nations goes its particular way and embodies it in a particular way. And perhaps most interesting for the kinds of things that I want to consider is the tension between, say, Wilson's understanding and Lenin's, which are emerging roughly at the same time in relation to the question of small states. So thank you for that. That's a very, very provocative question, set of questions.
Yes? Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. There's nothing like building dramatic tension. Thank you for your presentation, David. It was really enlightening. And on a personal note, and I come from a even more different background to some of the other people who've asked questions. I do research on African literature, and I actually use particularly conscripts of modernity as a way of looking at narrative methodology.
Narrative what, I'm sorry?
My narrative methodology. I'm particularly interested in your reapproach to ways of reading, and particularly something that's in Refashioning Futures and in Conscripts of Modernity, but hasn't been elaborated upon yet tonight, which is kind of the dissatisfaction you generally express in both texts with post-colonial discourse and post-colonial theoretical discourse.
With myself, in other words.
Yes. Yeah, and I particularly found it interesting your ideas about confronting problematic narratives, which obviously comes to fruition in Conscripts of Modernity. I kind of have two questions, really. One's quite basic, the other one it kind of links into what other people have been asking. Have you yourself seen a shift since Conscripts of Modernity's publication in 2004 in terms of post-colonial theories approaching narratives, and particularly problematic narratives? I'm thinking about the idea of tragedy, which I think is very useful. And I think I see reflected in the work of people like Neil Lazarus and Benita Parry at Warwick University, although they haven't quoted you yet. And the second one is, lots been mentioned already about the Arab Spring, North African Spring. Are we too keen, do you think, to grasp onto reclaiming the revolutionary narrative? Because it seems to be something that you're arguing that C.L.R. James cautions against, particularly in the appendix that he wrote later, and also you yourself seem to advocate as well.
Cautious about reclaiming the revolutionary narrative.
Yes, yeah, that was the romantic idea of it.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for using conscripts in your class and work. That's one of the things that always animates me or worries me is the moment in any kind of theoretical strategy in which the mode of the theoretical strategy comes itself to be taken for granted. And that to me is the moment when theory is freezing into method, when it can simply be employed, it can be taken. And that is often, for me, the moment when we need to think against ourselves. We need to push against the inclination to apply. And so there is an irritation that I feel and express about post-structuralism as social constructionism, post-colonial theory as a critique of representations of the West, etc., that are retailed in this frozen state, as though they're supposed to produce an answer. And not that that work has not opened up scholarly space, critical space, etc. I'm all for that. But once we have gone around that block a number of times, it's unclear again what the contrast effect we are going to produce within our own theoretical strategies. And that is something that I wonder about a lot. And so, you know, what I say about post-structuralism, throwing the baby out with the bath, I mean, I'm thinking about myself, obviously. I'm thinking about, so it's as much self-criticism. Having said that, I would have to admit that I don't read much that is now called post-colonialism or post-colonial theory. So you would have to tell me, as someone who teaches that sort of thing, what it is now doing. I have no idea. And part of the reason is that, I mean, I don't think I've ever had any idea, and I think I use it rather as a kind of polemical nomenclature rather than as, because I think to try and produce a content in it would be to mire myself into distracting kinds of preoccupations. I don't know that post-colonialism constitutes a unitary body of, so I mean, or whether there's a post-colonial condition, whether there's something recognizably, called post-colonial. I mean, that's, I agree, I find myself agreeing very often with those who, with a great deal of irritation, criticize people, perhaps like myself, who use that very term as though we already know what it signifies. And I try, I hope, to use it in a way that holds it tightly to the particular set of formulations that and the work that I want it to do. I am, of course, like everybody, caught off guard and looking on with anxiety and hope for the politics of upheaval that we have very quickly called the Arab Spring. I am not at all certain what its implications are, much less whether we can collect together the demands as a kind of unitary complex of criticisms. I mean, we know obviously that there are critiques of dictators and a demand for freedom and democracy, but what that signifies is not at all clear to me, and I suspect that I am myself very skeptical, because I am very skeptical about the uses of democracy and freedom to frame our political horizons. Those terms seem to me so overdetermined by a contemporary ideological moment, driven in many ways by obviously US foreign policy and so on. So I am very skeptical about what that, anyway, but still, you know, I can't be unmoved by it, and I can't not ask myself what the implications are for the ways in which I have urged, I'm trying to be very cautious and careful here not to get myself into more trouble than I have already gotten myself into, but that I have urged that we should be careful about the way in which we retell history as though we are the course and project and horizon of a revolutionary narrative is self-evident. And I think I want to retain the motivation and impetus of that way of thinking. But it may be that one will have to re-semanticize the question of revolution and think again about what kinds of narratives the revolution can play a critical role in. And I think that that's a real important challenge for us. And that's partly, I mean, this is written before the events of the quote-unquote Arab Spring and then revised and so on later. But I felt I had to wonder, I mean, the whole essay is wondering out loud whether in our posty declarations against universal history, what is it, again, to return to this question, what do we mean by universal? What is it about universal history that we are decrying? What is it that is wrong with universal history? And I wondered that partly because of the obvious continued attractiveness of a text like the Black Jacobins. We continue to read it, to be absorbed, to be compelled by it. And is it the case that that what we are compelled by is its philosophic structure, or are we compelled by something else? And if indeed we can bracket out the philosophic structure and allow ourselves to think about the poetics of its compulsion, then maybe there is something else about the story of universal history that might remain instructive for the way in which we think the future and the present. And so that's kind of what I am tentatively reaching after. So thank you very much for that.
Okay. I think that's a good moment, I think, to bring the formal discussion to a close. So maybe just end with thanking David Scott again for his presentation. Thank you.
And thank you very much.
And thank you for contributing.
Thank you very much, Christian. So you're going to run?
I'm going to run.
You're going to run?
I'm going to run.
Okay, man. So let's be in touch.
Yeah.
Both about this, but I want to hear what's happening with the... I'm looking forward to that, getting that book and to hear what's happening.
Yeah. I'll email
yeah.
you. That's okay.
Okay.
But thank you so much.
All right, man.
Okay.
All right.
Have a safe journey back to...
Okay. You too, man.